The first sound was the snap of a seatbelt being unlatched by someone who did not intend to leave quietly. It cut through the first-class cabin like a warning shot. Heads turned, breath caught. The plane was still at the gate, engines idling, cabin lights dimmed to that soft amber meant to calm people before long flights. Instead, the air tightened. The man in Seat 1 Alpha did not move. He sat upright, shoulders squared, hands resting flat on his thighs. His suit was dark, well cut, the kind that didn't announce its price. His face was calm, almost detached, but his jaw held tension, a thin line of restraint. The flight attendant standing over him mistook that stillness for defiance. She had already decided who he was. "Sir," she said, voice tight, pitched just loud enough for witnesses. "You need to stand up. Right now." Across the aisle, a white-haired couple stopped whispering. A man in the second row lowered his phone halfway, pretending not to record while doing exactly that. Somewhere behind them, a glass clinked against a tray table. The cabin had become a theater, and everyone knew a line had been crossed. The man finally looked up. His eyes were steady, not angry, not pleading, just measuring. He spoke softly. "I'm not refusing instructions. I'm asking for a reason." The reason was already forming in the attendant's mind, stitched together from habit, pressure, and something uglier she would never name. She glanced past him to the man standing near the galley, tall, broad-shouldered, red-faced from lounge bourbon and impatience. A frequent flyer tag swung from his carry-on like a badge. He didn't need to speak. His presence was the instruction. "There's a seating conflict," the attendant said. "We're resolving it." The man in 1 Alpha exhaled through his nose. Slow, controlled. He could feel the eyes on his back, the quiet math being done by strangers who had already chosen a side. He reached into his jacket and produced his boarding pass, holding it between 2 fingers. "I bought this seat," he said. "I paid full fare. This seat is mine." She didn't take the paper. She didn't need to. She had already looked. She already knew it was valid. That was the problem. Valid didn't fit the story she needed to tell to keep the aisle clear and the clock moving. "Sir," she said again, sharper now, "you're delaying the flight." Behind her, the man with the frequent flyer tag smiled thinly. He leaned in, close enough for the first 2 rows to hear. "Buddy," he said, voice oily, "just take the voucher. They'll put you somewhere else. You don't want to make this a thing." A thing. The word hung there. The man in 1 Alpha felt it land in his chest, heavy with years of similar moments. Hotel lobbies, boardrooms, security desks, places where his presence always required explanation. He looked past the speaker to the window. Outside, a ground crewman waved glowing batons in a practiced rhythm. The plane was ready. The system was always ready to move on without him. "I'm not moving," he said. His voice did not rise. That made it worse. The attendant straightened, her shoulders pulled back, authority settling in like armor. "Captain," she said into the intercom clipped at her waist, "we have a non-compliant passenger in first class, requesting security." The word non-compliant rippled through the cabin. Phones came up more openly now. A woman 2 rows back pressed her lips together, eyes flicking between the man and the attendant, unease creasing her forehead. She would later tell her husband she knew something was wrong the moment that word was used. Security arrived quickly. 2 officers, broad, efficient, faces already closed off. They filled the aisle, blocking light. One of them glanced at the man in 1 Alpha, then at the attendant. He did not ask questions. He had heard the story before he boarded. "Sir," the officer said, "you need to come with us." The man stood, slowly. The seat cushions sighed as his weight lifted. He was taller than most people expected, which drew a flicker of surprise from the officer. He reached up, retrieved a slim briefcase from the overhead bin. Leather creaked softly. He turned once, eyes sweeping the cabin. "I want it clear," he said, voice carrying now, not loud but impossible to ignore. "I have not raised my voice. I have not threatened anyone. I am being removed from a seat I paid for." The attendant crossed her arms. "Sir, let's go." They walked him down the aisle, past champagne flutes, past folded newspapers, past people who would later replay this moment and wonder why they hadn't said anything. The jet bridge swallowed him in fluorescent light. The door closed behind him with a sound that felt final. At the gate, the noise returned. Announcements, rolling bags, a child crying. The officer gestured toward a row of plastic chairs. "Sit." The man sat. He set the briefcase at his feet. Only then did his hand shake, just once, as the adrenaline drained. He took out his phone. The screen lit his face. Several missed messages waited there, stacked from the last hour. He ignored them. He opened a new contact. The call connected on the second ring. "It happened," he said. No anger, just fact. On the other end, a woman listened, pen already moving across paper. She did not interrupt. When he finished, there was a pause. Then, "Understood. Do you want us to initiate review?" "Yes," he said. "Preserve everything. Cabin logs, crew reports, passenger footage. All of it." He ended the call and leaned back. Across the glass, he could see the aircraft, its white body gleaming under gate lights. Passengers were settling in, unaware that something had shifted beneath them. Not the plane, the ground it rested on. Inside the cockpit, the captain ran through his checklist, unaware that an email was already being drafted to the airline's legal department. A notice of potential exposure. Language careful, cold, precise. Words like pattern and liability and duty of care. In the first-class cabin, the man with the frequent flyer tag reclined, satisfied. The seat fit him perfectly. He ordered another drink. He would tell this story later as a small victory, a reminder of how things worked when you knew how to push. At headquarters, several states away, a compliance officer felt his stomach tighten as the subject line flashed across his screen. Incident Review Request. He had seen enough of these to know what followed. Meetings, depositions, headlines that never used the word alleged kindly. Back at the gate, the man who had been forced to deplane watched the jet bridge retract. The plane pushed back, slow and deliberate. He did not look angry now. He looked focused, as if the noise around him had faded, replaced by something deeper. He stood when the aircraft disappeared from view, slipped the briefcase strap over his shoulder. Around him, people stared, curious, uneasy. None of them knew his name. None of them knew that a single call had already begun to test the strength of an entire institution. Not through spectacle, not through revenge, but through rules the airline itself had signed and sworn to follow. The email hit the compliance inbox before the plane reached cruising altitude. It was flagged urgent, red bar across the top, the kind of marker that made people sit straighter without knowing why. It carried no emotion, just facts. Timestamps, gate number, passenger status. Removal without physical resistance. Allegation of differential treatment. Attached files pending. In a glass-walled conference room overlooking a river of brake lights on the interstate, 3 executives leaned toward a screen. None of them spoke at first. They were trained not to react quickly. Reaction was for amateurs. What they felt instead was a slow, creeping pressure, like a change in air density before turbulence. "This is not good," someone finally said. Not loud, not panicked. Worse. Flat. At 30,000 feet, the cabin had relaxed. Seatbelt signs off, conversations resumed. The man now occupying seat 1 Alpha stretched his legs, satisfied. He laughed too loudly at something on his phone. He ordered a steak, medium rare, and complained when it arrived medium. The attendant apologized twice. Her smile returned, brittle but obedient. She avoided looking at the empty space where another man had been minutes earlier. In row 3, a woman with wire-rimmed glasses replayed the video she had captured. She had not meant to record at first. It had just happened. Instinct. The way people reached for phones now, the way they once reached for witnesses. She watched the quiet man stand, the way he spoke, the way no one helped. Her stomach tightened. She didn't post it yet. Something told her to wait. On the ground, the man who had been removed walked through the terminal slowly, the noise washing over him. He felt the familiar burn behind his eyes, the one he never allowed to surface in public. Anger was easy. Indignation was expected. What he felt instead was something colder. Disappointment sharpened into resolve. He stopped at a cafe, ordered black coffee, sat where he could see the departures board. London, Paris, Frankfurt. Names that meant nothing and everything. He checked his phone. Messages had multiplied. Advisors, partners, a board member who always called too late. He answered none of them. Not yet. The call he made instead went to a man who rarely spoke unless necessary. "I need you to look at something," he said. Not to attack, to understand exposure. There was a pause. The man on the other end understood the difference. "Send it," he said. By the time the plane crossed the Atlantic, the airline's internal channels were alive with quiet motion. Legal flagged operations. Operations flagged communications. Communications drafted 3 versions of a statement they hoped they would never release. No one said the word lawsuit out loud. They didn't need to. It hovered over every conversation. In the crew rest area, the attendant who had called security sat alone, arms folded tight against her chest. Her confidence had begun to crack. Not because she thought she was wrong, because the silence after the incident felt different than before. No reassuring nods, no casual jokes, just space. She replayed the moment in her head, the look in his eyes. Not fear, not submission. Something else. As if he had already stepped past her, past the plane, into a future she could not see. Hours later, the captain was called into a secure room upon landing. No anger in the request. That was worse. 2 people waited for him, one from safety, one from legal. They asked him to recount the incident in detail. He did. He did not embellish. He did not defend. When he finished, the legal representative nodded slowly. "Did he threaten anyone?" she asked. "No," the captain said. "Did he raise his voice?" "No." "Was he impaired?" "No." She closed her notebook. "Thank you." In another city, far from the airport, a man in a dark office watched the video for the first time. He watched it twice. Then once more without sound. He noticed details others missed. The angle of the camera, the timing of the command, the absence of escalation. He leaned back, fingers steepled. "They're exposed," he said quietly. "Not ruined, not destroyed. Exposed." The difference mattered. The woman from row 3 posted the video the next morning. Not with commentary, just a caption. This didn't feel right. It moved slowly at first, then faster. People shared it, not because it was explosive, but because it was familiar. Comments stacked, some defensive, some angry, some tired. A reporter sent a message asking for permission to verify. She said yes. By the end of the day, the airline issued a statement. Carefully worded. Regret for inconvenience. Commitment to review. No admission. No denial. The man who had been removed read it on his phone and nodded once. He took another call. This time he answered. "We proceed," he said. "Not publicly, not emotionally. We proceed correctly." On a late-night cable segment, an analyst spoke about reputational risk, about patterns, about how these moments were no longer isolated. The airline stock dipped slightly. Nothing dramatic. Enough to be noticed. Enough to be questioned. In a quiet apartment, the man sat at his kitchen table, coffee gone cold. He thought about the years he had spent believing that excellence alone was protection, that credentials were armor, that if he stayed calm, stayed measured, the system would meet him halfway. He thought about the attendant's voice, the officer's hand near his belt, the way the aisle had narrowed around him. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere above them, planes traced invisible lines across the sky. Systems moving. People trusting. He did not smile. He did not feel triumphant. What he felt was responsibility. Because once you saw the fault lines clearly, you could not unsee them. And once you knew where pressure broke systems open, you had a choice. Do nothing, or apply it. He picked up his phone again. Not to threaten, not to boast, but to begin something that could not be undone once it started. By the third morning, the word review had stopped meaning what it usually did. Inside the airline, it no longer meant a checklist or a quiet memo. It meant people whispering in hallways. It meant calendars filling without explanations. It meant senior staff reading emails twice before forwarding them, aware that every sentence might one day be read aloud in a room with no windows and a court reporter in the corner. The man who had been removed from the plane woke before dawn. He lay still for a moment, listening to the city breathe. Sirens far away. A delivery truck downshifting. He had slept badly, not from fear, but from the weight of unfinished thought. He dressed without ceremony. Simple shirt, jacket, shoes polished out of habit. When he left his apartment, the doorman nodded, unaware that anything unusual had happened. That anonymity felt almost surreal. At airline headquarters, a vice president of operations stared at a screen showing timelines. Not numbers, events. Call made, security requested, passenger removed. Each line was a decision made by a person who had believed they were acting within bounds. That belief was now under examination. He rubbed his eyes. "We followed protocol," he said, to no one in particular. "Protocol is not a shield," Legal replied from the end of the table. Her voice was calm. "It's a record." In a training center near the airport, the attendant sat across from a union representative. Her posture was rigid, chin lifted too high. She had spent the night rehearsing her justification, refining it into something that sounded reasonable even to her own ears. "He wouldn't move," she said. "I had a flight to protect." The representative listened, hands folded. Did he raise his voice? No. Threaten you? No. Did he meet the criteria for removal? She hesitated. That pause was small, but it changed the temperature in the room. "I believed he did," she said, finally. Across town, the video continued to spread. Not explosively, persistently. It found its way into group texts, into office Slack channels, into dinner conversations where someone would say, "Did you see this?" and someone else would nod, tired. The comments were no longer shouting. They were dissecting, asking quieter questions. Why was that the response? Why did no one intervene? Why did it feel so familiar? A producer from a morning show called the man who had been removed. He declined, politely. "I'm not interested in becoming a talking point," he said. The producer tried again, framing it as an opportunity. He ended the call. What he did agree to was a meeting in a neutral office, high above the street, with two people who had not been part of the original incident. One specialized in compliance frameworks, the other in risk modeling. They spread documents across a table, pages sliding softly against polished wood. "This isn't about intent," the first said. "It's about pattern." "And pattern," the second added, "is where liability lives." They spoke for over an hour, about discretionary power, about how speed and pressure eroded judgment, about how organizations trained people to prioritize efficiency without equipping them to recognize their own blind spots. The man listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was precise, grounded in experience, not accusation, observation. On the airline's social media channels, replies piled up beneath the official statement. The tone had shifted. Less outrage, more disappointment. Long-time customers asked questions that had no easy answers. Crew members, anonymous, defended the attendant with language that revealed more than they intended. Lines hardened. Late that afternoon, the chief executive was briefed. Not with drama, with facts. Exposure projections, insurance implications. A graph showing trust erosion over time. He sat back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes unfocused. He had spent his career believing in systems, in escalation paths, in checks and balances. This felt like something slipping through fingers. "What does he want?" he asked. No one answered immediately, because that was the wrong question. At home that evening, the man stood at his kitchen sink, washing a single plate. He thought about the officer's hand near his belt, about the attendant's voice when it hardened, about how quickly neutrality had turned into force. He was not interested in punishment. He was interested in consequence. There was a difference. His phone buzzed, a message from someone he trusted. "They're asking for a meeting." He replied with one word: listen. The meeting took place 2 days later, not at the airline, not at his office. A conference room borrowed from a mediation firm that prided itself on neutrality. No logos, no branding. Just glass, light, and a long table. The airline representatives arrived first. They chose seats carefully. When the man entered, there was a subtle shift. Not deference, recognition. Of gravity, not status. No one apologized immediately. That came later. They spoke about procedures, about training, about what was technically allowed. He listened, eyes steady, hands folded. When they finished, he spoke. "You keep saying no rules were broken," he said. "That's the problem. Your rules allow this." Silence settled. Someone cleared their throat. "I was removed because it was easier," he continued. "Easier than questioning an assumption. Easier than disappointing a loyal customer. Easier than slowing down." That choice didn't end at the gate. It traveled through your systems, through your people. One of them leaned forward. "What would you have us do?" He considered the question, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to be sure they understood it. "Change what you measure," he said. "Right now you measure time, turnover, compliance. Measure judgment. Measure restraint. Measure how often your people pause instead of escalate." They took notes, not performatively, carefully. Outside, the city moved. Planes landed, planes departed. Most people would never know how close this moment had come to becoming something louder, something uglier. Instead, it pressed inward, reshaping quietly. When the meeting ended, there were no handshakes for cameras, no statements, just a sense that something irreversible had begun. That night, the man walked through his neighborhood. Couples passed him. A dog tugged at its leash. Ordinary life, resilient and indifferent. He felt tired, not defeated, changed. Above him, A plane traced a white line across the darkening sky. He watched it until it vanished. He knew now that the danger had never been the removal itself. It was the certainty with which it had been done, and the ease with which everyone else had accepted it. That was what he intended to disrupt. The shift did not announce itself. It arrived the way pressure does, quietly, unevenly, until something buckled. Inside the airline, the language changed first. Emails stopped using phrases like isolated incident and began using contextual exposure. Meetings, once labeled operational, became strategic. People who had never spoken to each other before suddenly shared calendar invites with no agendas attached. The man who had demanded Seat 1 Alpha woke to a different world than the one he expected to inherit from his small victory. His phone was heavier now, not with praise, with questions. His partners wanted distance. His assistant asked if she should reschedule meetings. He snapped at her once, then apologized immediately. He was not used to this feeling. He had spent his life pushing through systems, not being slowed by them. At his office, the screens glowed with market data. Everything looked normal. Too normal. That was the problem. He pulled a report from his desk, one he had ignored for months. Risk Alignment Review. He had skimmed it once, signed it, moved on. Now he read it line by line. Each paragraph felt like a quiet accusation. Across the country, in a corner office with a view of the runway, the airline's chief risk officer watched planes take off and wondered which one might be carrying the next problem. She had been hired to think this way, to imagine failures before they happened. This one had slipped past her because it had looked like nothing at all. A man removed, a flight delayed by minutes, a box checked. She picked up the phone and called someone she trusted outside the company. "I need an independent assessment," she said. "Not a defense, a diagnosis." In a rented conference room near the airport, the attendant sat again, this time with two people she had never met. One from compliance, one from human resources. No union rep now, no script, just questions. They asked her to walk through the incident again, slowly. When she reached the moment she decided to call security, her voice wavered. "I didn't feel unsafe," she admitted. The words surprised her as they left her mouth. "Then what did you feel?" the compliance officer asked. She searched for an answer that would not make her look small. "Pressured," she said finally. "I felt like if I didn't act, I would lose control of the cabin." "Control of what?" the officer asked. She looked down. "The situation." The pause that followed was long, not judgmental, clinical. On social media, the conversation matured. It stopped being about outrage and started being about recognition. Older viewers commented about things they had seen and never named. Men talked about moments when staying calm had cost them dignity. Women talked about complicity, about choosing the path that kept things moving. The story became a mirror, and not everyone liked what they saw. The man who had been removed watched it all from a distance. He did not engage, he did not correct. He understood something most people did not. Once a narrative escaped, control was an illusion. What mattered was not how loudly it spread, but where it landed. He took a meeting with an old friend who ran a small consulting firm that specialized in corporate failure. Not collapse, failure. The slow kind that began with culture and ended with headlines. "They're exposed," his friend said after reviewing the materials. "Not because they broke the law, because they taught people to hide behind it." At the airline, the chief executive received a call he had been dreading. The insurer wanted clarification. Not cancellation, not yet. But clarification was the first step. He stared at the wall as the voice on the other end outlined conditions. Increased premiums, revised exclusions. A reminder that reputational harm was no longer abstract. "Can we fix this?" he asked when the call ended. The risk officer did not answer immediately. She had learned that timing mattered. "We can change," she said. "Fixing implies returning to what we were. That's not possible." The man with the frequent flyer tag sat in a private lounge in another city, flipping through channels he did not watch. He had expected the story to burn out, to be replaced by something louder. Instead, it lingered. He noticed the way people looked at him now when he spoke too loudly, the way a bartender paused before refilling his glass. He called a colleague, looking for reassurance. The conversation ended quickly. Too quickly. When he hung up, the silence felt heavier than any accusation. Back in the mediation office, a second meeting was scheduled. This time, the airline brought more people, fewer titles, more listeners. The man arrived with no entourage. He wore the same jacket, the same calm. "We want to understand what accountability looks like," someone said. Their voice was careful, not defensive. He considered them. He could see fatigue in their faces, not guilt. Fatigue came first. "Accountability isn't punishment," he said. "It's memory. You don't need to destroy anyone. You need to remember this the next time someone looks inconvenient." They nodded, not because they agreed, because they understood the risk of not appearing to. That evening, a draft policy circulated internally. It proposed changes to escalation authority, required pauses, mandatory second opinions in non-emergency removals, training modules that did not use the word bias as an abstraction, but as a behavior with consequences. Some people welcomed it, others resented it. Progress always split the room. The attendant received notice of reassignment pending further review, not termination, not absolution. She sat on her bed and stared at the letter. Relief and fear tangled in her chest. She thought about the man's eyes, about the way he had stood without rushing, about how quickly she had reached for authority instead of understanding. She did not sleep. The man walked again that night. Same streets, same lights. He felt the story pulling away from him now, becoming something larger, less personal. That was as it should be. His phone buzzed, a message from the airline, a formal request. They wanted to issue a joint statement, not an apology, a commitment. He read it twice. Then he typed a response, short, direct. "Do not center me," he wrote. "Center the behavior, and what you will do when it happens again." He sent it and slipped the phone into his pocket. Above him, another plane crossed the sky, steady and indifferent. He watched it disappear and felt something loosen in his chest. Not victory, not closure. Momentum. And momentum, he knew, was harder to stop than any single flight. The reckoning did not arrive with sirens or subpoenas. It came with calendars filling up months in advance, with questions that refused to be closed, with a cost that could not be insured away. By the fifth week, everyone understood this was no longer about a single flight or a single man. It was about whether the airline could survive the truth of what it had revealed about itself. The board convened in a room designed to make people feel powerful. Long table, thick carpet, windows that did not open. The chief executive sat at the head, hands clasped, listening as the general counsel walked them through scenarios. None of them sounded good. Not catastrophic. Worse. Slow erosion, brand dilution, talent loss. The kind of damage that did not make headlines every day, but hollowed a company out over years. "We are not being accused of malice," counsel said. "We are being accused of indifference." That landed harder than any allegation of intent. Across town, the man who had been removed from the flight sat in a smaller room with softer chairs and no view at all. He had agreed to one more meeting, this time with a mixed group, not just airline leadership. Regulators, a representative from a civil rights organization, a mediator who specialized in systemic disputes. The room carried the quiet tension of people who knew they were about to say things they could not take back. The regulator spoke first. She had a voice worn smooth by years of hearings. "We are not here to punish," she said. "We are here to understand risk. Risk to passengers, risk to operations, risk to public trust." The man nodded. He appreciated the precision. Risk was a language systems respected. A representative from the airline began to outline proposed changes. Revised escalation protocols, expanded training, a commitment to transparency. The words were familiar now, necessary, incomplete. The man waited until she finished, then he leaned forward slightly. The movement was small, but it drew the room toward him. "You keep treating this like a problem of rules," he said. "It's a problem of permission. Your people felt permitted to remove me because they believed the cost of removing me was lower than the cost of questioning someone else." No one interrupted. Pens hovered. "That permission didn't come from a manual," he continued. "It came from what you reward. Speed, deference to status, keeping discomfort away from the people you value most." The civil rights representative spoke next. Her voice carried quiet heat. She talked about patterns, about how often restraint was demanded from those least protected, about how dignity was rationed in moments of pressure. Heads nodded, some reluctantly. The mediator raised a hand. "What would meaningful repair look like?" he asked. The room turned to the man. He felt the weight of it. He had never wanted to be here. He had wanted a seat, a flight, a normal day. "Repair starts with acknowledgement," he said. "Not of wrongdoing, of harm. You don't have to agree with my interpretation to recognize the impact." The chief executive spoke for the first time. His voice was measured, careful. "We are prepared to do that," he said. "But we need to know how far this goes." The man met his gaze. "As far as it needs to," he said. "And no farther." Silence followed. Not hostile. Heavy. Outside the room, the story continued its quieter spread. Not trending now. Settling. Editorials appeared that did not shout. They asked questions. About power. About discretion. About what happened when systems were optimized for efficiency at the expense of humanity. The airline was no longer the villain of the week. It was the example. Internally, training sessions began. Not the glossy kind, the uncomfortable kind. Role plays that forced people to sit in silence, to wait, to ask themselves why they felt the urge to escalate. Some employees resisted. Others surprised themselves. Culture does not change uniformly. It fractures, then realigns. The attendant who had made the call watched one of these sessions from the back of the room. She had been reassigned to ground operations while the review concluded. She listened to a facilitator describe the cost of unnecessary force. She felt her throat tighten. She had replayed that moment 100 times by now, each time finding something new she wished she had done differently. Not to save herself, to save him from being the lesson. After the session, she did not leave immediately. She sat alone, hands clasped, staring at the floor. When she finally stood, her legs felt unsteady. Accountability, she realized, was not a verdict. It was a mirror you could not turn away from. The man received an email from the airline a few days later. A draft statement. Plain language, no legal hedging. It acknowledged the removal had caused harm, that the process had failed, that the airline would implement specific changes, some of which had come directly from the conversations. It did not mention him by name. He read it slowly. He forwarded it to 2 people he trusted. One replied with a single word. Solid. The other asked if he was comfortable with it. He thought about the aisle, the officer's hand, the sound of the jet bridge door closing. He thought about the woman from row 3, the way she had held her phone, uncertain but determined. He thought about how easily this could have disappeared. "Yes," he replied. "I'm comfortable." The statement went live the next morning. It did not go viral. It did not need to. It was picked up by the right people: analysts, advocates, industry insiders who understood what it meant for a company to admit vulnerability in a controlled way. The airline's stock wavered, then steadied. Not because the issue was resolved, but because uncertainty had been replaced with direction. Markets valued that. Weeks later, the man boarded another flight. Different airline, different route. He sat in economy by choice. The seat was narrow, the legroom tight. None of it bothered him. When a flight attendant passed, she smiled and asked if he needed anything. He shook his head. He did not need proof. He needed practice. As the plane lifted, he felt the familiar press into his seat, the vibration through the floor. He closed his eyes for a moment, thought about momentum, about how change rarely arrived as a single decisive blow. It arrived as a series of choices, made visible, then repeated. Somewhere behind him, a child laughed. Somewhere ahead, someone complained quietly. Ordinary life moving through metal and air. He opened his eyes and looked out the window. The city receded, lights scattering like constellations. He did not feel victorious. He felt accountable. And that, he knew, was the real risk systems feared. Not anger, not lawsuits, but people who remembered what they had seen and refused to forget it. The story did not end when the statement was released. It simply stopped belonging to the news cycle and began living inside the institution, where the real work was slower and far less visible. 6 months after the flight, Sovereign Air looked the same from the outside. The planes still carried the same livery. The uniforms were unchanged. The safety video still ended with the same polite smile. But inside the company, the atmosphere had shifted in ways that could not be undone. Meetings ran longer now, not because people talked more, but because silence was allowed to exist. Escalation decisions required documentation, not just what happened, but why it happened. The question why had become mandatory. That alone unsettled many. In one of the airline's busiest hubs, a gate agent paused during boarding when a disagreement broke out near the podium. 2 passengers, raised voices, a line forming behind them, the clock ticking towards departure. Months earlier, the agent would have called for help immediately. This time, she raised her hand and said calmly, "Give me 1 minute, just one." It was enough. The tension eased. The situation resolved without uniforms, without authority, without spectacle. No one applauded, but someone noticed. The man who had been removed from the flight was not invited to the training sessions, and he did not ask to be. His role had never been to oversee the repair, only to refuse silence. He returned to his routines: work, long walks, conversations that no longer circled around the incident, but occasionally brushed against it like a scar. Once, during a quiet dinner with an old colleague, he was asked if it had been worth it. The stress, the exposure, the weeks of being turned into a symbol he had never requested. He did not answer immediately. "I didn't do it to win," he said finally. "I did it because not responding would have taught them the wrong lesson." The colleague nodded. They both understood the weight of that. Inside the airline, the attendant who had called security completed her reassignment. She was offered a path back to the cabin, conditional, counseling, retraining, a probationary period. She accepted. Not gratefully, honestly. She had learned that gratitude could be another form of avoidance. On her first flight back, She stood in the galley before boarding began, hands resting on the counter, eyes closed for a brief moment. She reminded herself of the pause, the space between instruction and assumption. When passengers boarded, she met their eyes, all of them, not searching, acknowledging. She did not see him again. She did not expect to. The man with the frequent flyer tag lost his status quietly. Not publicly. No announcement. Just an email noting a review of account privileges. He called customer service and argued. He demanded to know why. The representative on the line did not raise her voice. She repeated the policy. Behavior mattered. Patterns mattered. He hung up, furious, then unsettled. For the first time, his certainty did not protect him. He told himself it was temporary. He did not quite believe it. A year after the incident, the airline released an internal report. Not glossy, not celebratory. It outlined changes made, mistakes acknowledged, metrics still lagging. It ended with a single line that stood out from the rest. Efficiency without judgment creates risk. The line circulated beyond the company, quoted in an industry panel, referenced in a white paper, not attributed to any one person. It did not need to be. The man read the report on a quiet Sunday morning. He sat by the window, coffee cooling in his hand. He felt no surge of pride, no sense of triumph. What he felt was something closer to relief. The kind that comes when you know a moment did not vanish into nothing. Later that day, he boarded another flight. Different city, different reason. As he walked down the aisle, he felt the familiar narrowing of space, the instinctive awareness of bodies and glances. Old habits died slowly. He took his seat, fastened his belt. The click echoed softly. A flight attendant passed, then stopped. "Sir," she said, "can I get you anything before we push back?" He looked up, met her eyes. She was younger than the last one, nervous but attentive. "No," he said. Then, after a beat, "Thank you for asking." She smiled, a real one this time. She moved on. The plane taxied. Engines rose. The ground fell away. As the city shrank beneath the clouds, the man rested his head against the seat and closed his eyes. He thought about how easily power disguised itself as routine, how quietly harm could be justified when everyone agreed it was necessary. He also thought about the pause, the one moment that could change the direction of an entire system if enough people chose to use it. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, he opened his eyes. The cabin exhaled around him. Somewhere behind him, someone laughed. Somewhere ahead, someone complained. Ordinary life, continuing. He did not smile. But for the first time since the gate, he felt something settle inside him. Not closure, continuity. And that, he knew, was how real change survived. The seventh ripple was quieter, but it reached farther than any headline ever could. It surfaced months later, in places that had never heard the man's name, and never would. A regional airport in the Midwest, a budget airline training room in Arizona, a corporate compliance workshop in New Jersey, where someone pulled up a slide titled "Non-Emergency Passenger Removal," and paused longer than the instructor expected. People had begun to reference the incident without referencing it. They said things like, "We don't want another one of those situations," or "Let's slow this down before it turns into a review," or simply, "Let's get a second opinion." The language was careful, stripped of drama, but it carried weight. Systems learned the way people did, through memory, not morality. The man who had been forced to deplane never set out to create that. He would have preferred anonymity. He would have preferred to arrive in London on time, to sit through a long meeting, to return home without a story. Instead, He found himself becoming a reference point in conversations he would never hear. He accepted that, with a kind of tired clarity. One afternoon, he received an email from a junior analyst at a company he had once advised. The message was hesitant, almost apologetic. The analyst wrote about witnessing a passenger removal during a business trip, about recognizing the early signs of escalation, about speaking up when it felt uncomfortable to do so. The situation had de-escalated. No security, no shouting, just a pause. "I don't know if this matters," the analyst wrote, "but I thought you should know." The man read the message twice. He did not reply immediately. When he finally did, it was brief. "It matters," he wrote. "Thank you for noticing." Across the industry, consultants added quiet footnotes to report. Insurers revised risk models, adjusting premiums by fractions that looked insignificant on paper, but signaled something deeper. Regulators referenced behavioral indicators more frequently. None of it made news. All of it changed behavior. At Sovereign Air, the changes began to harden into habit. New hires learned that authority was conditional, that removal was a last resort, not a reflex, that discomfort alone did not constitute danger. Some veterans resented it. Others welcomed the clarity. A few left. Culture always shed what it could not carry forward. The former attendant transferred bases again, this time by choice. She volunteered for mentoring duty, quietly. She never spoke about the incident unless asked. When she was asked, she did not defend herself. She described the moment honestly. The pressure, the fear of losing control, the cost of choosing speed over judgment. Younger crew members listened closely, not because she was proud of it, because she wasn't. The man with the frequent flyer tag faded from relevance. Not ruined, not redeemed, simply less central. He still traveled, he still complained, but the system no longer bent around him the way it once had. That was perhaps the most disorienting consequence of all. For the man at the center of it, life continued with deliberate normalcy. He worked. He declined invitations to speak on panels that wanted spectacle. He accepted a few that wanted substance. In those rooms, he spoke less about what happened to him and more about what happened around him. The quiet agreements, the unspoken permissions, the invisible hierarchies that shaped outcomes before anyone believed a choice had been made. People listened, some defensively, some hungrily. One evening, long after the story had settled into professional memory, he found himself back at an airport, waiting out a delay. The gate was crowded, tempers short. A gate agent struggled to calm a disagreement at the podium. Voices rose. Phones came out. A man watched, not intervening, not disengaging, just observing. The agent took a breath, a visible one. She raised her hands slightly. "I need a moment," she said. "I want to get this right." The words landed. The crowd quieted, not completely, but enough. The argument softened. Solutions emerged. Boarding resumed late, but intact. No one applauded. No one filmed. No one would remember this as a story. The man smiled then, briefly, to himself, because that was how change actually announced itself. Not with collapse, not with revenge, but with small hesitations where certainty used to live, with people choosing to pause when it would be easier not to. He gathered his bag when boarding was called and stepped into line with everyone else. No priority, no special treatment. Just another passenger moving through a system that, slowly, had learned to look back at itself. As he handed over his boarding pass, the agent met his eyes. Not searching, not assessing, simply present. "Have a good flight," she said. He nodded. "You too." And for the first time, the exchange felt exactly as ordinary as it should have been. The eighth movement arrived without ceremony, the way institutional memory always did. not as a lesson taught, but as a reflex absorbed. At an industry conference in Denver, a panel on operational resilience drifted off script. A senior executive from a rival airline spoke about efficiency curves and cost control, then stopped himself mid-sentence. He glanced at the moderator, then back at the audience. "There's a point," he said, choosing his words carefully, "where optimizing the system creates blind spots. We've all seen what happens then." Heads nodded. No one asked him to clarify. They didn't need him to. In the back row, a woman from a regional carrier scribbled a note she would later turn into a policy draft. It was not radical. It did not promise perfection. It simply inserted friction where speed had once ruled. A required pause, a second set of eyes, a documented rationale when removal was considered without an immediate safety threat. It would slow things down by seconds, maybe minutes. She knew the cost. She also knew the cost of not doing it. The man who had been forced to deplane never attended that conference. He was across the country, in a windowless room, listening to a younger colleague argue passionately for a process change that sounded familiar. He let her finish. Then he asked one question. What happens when the person with the least power is also the one creating the inconvenience? She hesitated, thought, then smiled, not confidently, but honestly. "Then the system has to work harder," she said, "or it's not a system worth keeping." He nodded. That was the answer. At Sovereign Air, the changes continued to settle into place, unevenly but unmistakably. Metrics were updated. Performance reviews included new language, not buzzwords, scenarios. Managers were asked to describe moments when they had chosen restraint. Some struggled. Others surprised themselves. The company did not become virtuous overnight. It became cautious in a way that mattered. The chief executive walked the floor more often now. Not for optics, because he had learned something uncomfortable. Distance bred certainty. Proximity bred doubt. And doubt, when handled correctly, made better decisions than confidence ever had. The former attendant completed her probation and returned fully to the cabin. On her first long-haul flight back, she stood at the forward door as passengers boarded. She noticed things she had not noticed before. How quickly people categorized each other. How status announced itself without words. She noticed her own instincts flare, then settle. She had learned to wait for the second thought. It did not make her weaker. It made her steadier. Midway through boarding, a man stopped short in the aisle, confused about his seat assignment. A small backup formed behind him. The old pressure crept in. The clock. The eyes. She felt it, acknowledged it, then stepped closer, lowering her voice. They resolved it in under a minute. No one noticed. That was the point. The man with the frequent flyer tag sat in a different lounge now. Smaller, less exclusive. He still wore the same watch, still spoke with the same certainty, but when an argument broke out nearby over a delayed connection, he found himself watching instead of inserting himself. The room no longer bent automatically toward his irritation. He felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Not anger, uncertainty. He masked it quickly. Habits died hard. For the man at the center of the original incident, the story had become something he carried lightly, like a scar that no longer ached, but never quite disappeared. He noticed changes when he traveled, subtle ones. Crew members asking an extra question. Gate agents explaining decisions instead of announcing them. Not everywhere, not always. Enough to matter. He was careful not to confuse correlation with causation. Systems were larger than any individual. But moments could become reference points, and reference points, when repeated, became boundaries. One evening, he sat in an airport bar nursing a soda, watching a muted television cycle through headlines that no longer included him. A younger man at the next stool recognized him after a moment, hesitated, then spoke. "You were on that flight, right?" It was not accusatory, just curious. "Yes," he said. The man nodded. "My sister's a flight attendant. She said their training changed after that. Not just the slides, the conversations." He paused, searching for the right word. "Thanks." The man felt something tighten behind his ribs. He did not know how to respond to gratitude for something that had cost him more than anyone realized. He settled on honesty. "I didn't plan it," he said. "I know," the man replied. He paid his tab and left. Later that night, the man stood at a window overlooking a runway, watching planes queue in patient lines of light. Each one represented thousands of decisions layered atop one another. Engineering, policy, habit, assumption. Change was never dramatic from this distance. It was incremental, almost invisible. His phone buzzed. A message from a contact he hadn't heard from in years. A question about advising on a review board. He read it, considered, then replied that he would observe, not lead. Systems needed witnesses as much as architects. As he put the phone away, a plane roared overhead, close enough to rattle the glass. He watched it climb, steady and deliberate, and felt the familiar mix of awe and caution. Flight had always been a miracle balanced on discipline. He turned from the window and headed toward his gate. Another trip. Another ordinary moment in a life that had become unexpectedly consequential. When boarding began, there was a brief delay, a disagreement near the front. The line murmured. Someone sighed loudly. The agent raised her hand. "Thank you for your patience," she said. "We're making sure we get this right." The man waited. So did everyone else. The delay lasted less than 2 minutes. No one missed a connection. No one was removed. The system held. As he stepped onto the plane, he felt no satisfaction, only recognition of how fragile fairness was, and how powerful it could become when enough people chose, again and again, not to rush past it. That was the 8th ripple. Not a collapse, not a victory. A habit. The 9th movement was the one no one documented, because it lived entirely in private reckoning. It unfolded in kitchens after long shifts, in parked cars with engines still running, in the quiet space between unlocking the door and turning on the lights. It surfaced when people replayed moments they had once dismissed as routine and felt, for the first time, the discomfort of seeing them clearly. A supervisor at a regional hub sat at her dining table one night, paperwork spread out but untouched. She kept thinking about a decision she had made years earlier. A passenger she had labeled difficult because it was easier than admitting she didn't want to challenge the person pressuring her from the other side of the counter. At the time, it had felt efficient, necessary. Now, it felt unfinished. She did not know what to do with that feeling yet, only that she could no longer ignore it. In another city, a retired pilot watched a segment on late-night television about discretionary authority. The story was familiar, stripped of names, softened by time. He shook his head slowly. He remembered times he had deferred to cabin crew without asking questions because it kept things smooth. He had told himself that smooth meant safe. He was no longer certain that was true. For the man at the center of the original incident, this was the part that mattered most, even though he would never see it. He had never believed change came from policies alone. Policies followed permission. Permission followed belief. And belief lived where no compliance officer could reach. He noticed it in conversations that ended differently now. People hesitating before making jokes that relied on old shortcuts. Colleagues interrupting themselves mid-sentence, reconsidering a word. Silence stretching a second longer than before, not from fear, but from thought. Once, during a flight delay, He watched a disagreement unfold a few rows ahead of him. A passenger stood in the aisle, frustrated but controlled. A flight attendant listened, arms relaxed at her sides. No one reached for authority. No one raised their voice. It resolved quietly. He felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. The absence of spectacle was the point. The man with the frequent flyer tag felt the shift too, though he would never name it that way. He found himself pushing less. Not because he had grown kinder, but because pushing no longer guaranteed results. Systems that once bent quickly now pushed back gently. He felt diminished and told himself it was bureaucracy. He did not examine why it unsettled him so deeply. At Sovereign Air, the incident faded from onboarding decks and resurfaced only in advanced training, where examples were no longer sanitized. New hires were asked how they would feel making the same call. They were not told what the correct answer was. They were told to sit with the discomfort of not knowing. Some left. Others stayed and grew quieter, more deliberate. The company did not become virtuous. It became aware. Awareness was slower, more expensive, harder to fake. The former attendant carried the weight differently now. She no longer tried to explain herself. When new crew members asked why certain procedures required extra steps, she answered simply, "Because people are not problems to be solved." She did not add context. She did not need to. The man walked through another terminal months later, rolling his bag behind him, blending into the crowd. No one recognized him. No one moved aside. He welcomed that. Power that needed to be seen was fragile. This kind was not. As he waited at his gate, he watched a young man argue with a gate agent about an upgrade. Voices rose slightly, not dangerously, just enough to draw attention. The agent listened, then shook her head. Calm, firm. The man scoffed and stepped back. The line moved on. No security, no escalation, no story. He sat back and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the ambient noise wash over him. Announcements, laughter, wheels on tile. 1,000 small interactions unfolding at once, most of them unseen. Each one a choice. When boarding was called, he stood with everyone else. He handed over his pass. The agent scanned it, smiled briefly, and waved him through. Nothing more. As he walked down the jet bridge, he thought about how close everything had come to becoming something uglier. How easily silence could have won. How many times it already had. This was not justice in the cinematic sense. There were no speeches, no villains undone in public squares. There was only the slow recalibration of a system, learning where it had been wrong. And that, he understood now, was the most dangerous outcome of all. Not because it destroyed anything, but because it taught people to see. Once that happened, going back was impossible. The boarding gate was quieter than he remembered, not because airports had changed, but because he had. The announcements rolled over the crowd in a familiar cadence, and the line moved with the resigned patience of people who had learned that rushing never made planes leave faster. He stood among them, coat folded over one arm, ticket in hand. Just another passenger again. And the ordinariness of it felt earned. He took his seat without incident. Middle of the cabin this time, no extra legroom, no curtain. The fabric smelled faintly of disinfectant and recycled air. He buckled in, the click echoing softly, and rested his head back as the plane pushed away from the gate. Outside the window, ground crews moved with practiced choreography, bright vests flashing, engines humming to life. It all looked the same. It wasn't. Across the aisle, a man argued quietly with a flight attendant about overhead space. The old him would have tensed, ready for the familiar tightening of the moment. Instead, he watched with a strange calm. The attendant listened. She didn't interrupt. She nodded, then explained patiently where the bag would go. The man sighed, annoyed but contained, and sat down. No escalation, no authority summoned. Just a small resolution that would never make headlines. His chest loosened, just a little. He thought about how close everything had come to unraveling months ago. Not in some spectacular collapse, but in the slow, corrosive way institutions failed when they refused to look at themselves. He had not wanted to be the spark. He had wanted to arrive on time. But sparks didn't choose where they landed, only whether they burned out or caught. The plane climbed through cloud, sunlight breaking through in sudden brilliance. He closed his eyes briefly, remembering the sound of the jet bridge door shutting behind him that day, the hollow finality of it. That sound had stayed with him longer than the anger, longer than the attention. It had been the sound of being decided for. When he opened his eyes again, the cabin was settled. People reading, people sleeping. Someone laughing softly at a movie he couldn't hear. Ordinary life at 30,000 feet. He took out his phone, scrolled past messages that no longer demanded immediate response, and stopped at one from a junior associate he barely knew. It was simple. A thank you. Not effusive, just honest. He locked the phone and slipped it away. At the airline, changes continued without his involvement. He knew that now. He had stepped back deliberately, refusing the invitations to lead, to become a figurehead. Systems didn't need saviors. They needed constraints. Memory. Friction in the right places. He had learned that power was most effective when it stopped short of domination and forced others to choose differently on their own. The flight attendant passed again, offering water. She met his eyes briefly, a professional glance that carried no assessment beyond the immediate need. He accepted the cup and thanked her. She smiled, a quick, unburdened expression, and moved on. He wondered what she had been taught, what stories had been told in training rooms since that day, how many pauses had been inserted into procedures that once rushed forward without thought. He would never know the full extent. That was fine. As the plane leveled off, his mind wandered to the people most changed by the incident. The woman who had filmed, uncertain but compelled. The attendant who had reached for authority and found herself staring into a mirror she couldn't look away from. The man who had assumed the system existed for his comfort alone and learned, quietly, that it didn't. None of them had been villains. None of them had been heroes. They had been human, moving within structures that rewarded some instincts and punished others. He looked out the window again. The clouds stretched endless and soft, deceptive in their calm. Flight had always been an exercise in trust. Trust in engineering, trust in training, trust in judgment. When one of those failed, the consequences rippled far beyond a single journey. That was the lesson he hoped would last, long after his name faded from internal reports and industry panels. The captain's voice came over the intercom, measured and warm, updating them on arrival time. The accent was different than last time. The tone felt the same. He listened, not for authority, but for care. It was there, in the pauses between words, in the absence of hurry. He smiled faintly. When the descent began, the cabin stirred. Tray tables up, seats upright, a familiar choreography rehearsed thousands of times a day across the world. He felt the subtle pressure change, the plane angling toward the earth, and thought about gravity, how it always asserted itself eventually. Institutions were no different. Ignore it long enough, and the fall became inevitable. Respect it, and you could land safely, even gracefully. The wheels touched down with a muted thump, applause scattered and brief. As they taxied to the gate, he felt no surge of triumph, no lingering bitterness. What remained was something quieter and more durable. A sense that a line had been drawn, not in anger, but in clarity. A refusal to accept that efficiency excused erasure, that calm compliance was the price of dignity. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, people stood quickly, crowding the aisle. He waited, unhurried, letting the rush pass him by. Outside, the terminal lights glowed against the dusk. Another arrival, another ordinary ending. As he stepped into the jet bridge, he caught his reflection in the glass. Older, perhaps, not diminished, grounded in a way he hadn't been before. He adjusted his jacket, squared his shoulders, and walked forward with the steady confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove he belonged. Stories like this often ended with collapse or coronation. This one ended with continuity, with systems still standing, slightly altered, carrying the imprint of a moment when silence had not been chosen. He blended into the stream of passengers moving toward baggage claim, anonymous again. And that anonymity felt like a gift. If this story stayed with you, take a second to like, subscribe, and comment below.